It was just another quiet morning in the neighborhood Clara May Robinson had called home for more than 70 years. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light across cracked sidewalks and old brick homes. The air smelled faintly of dew and magnolias, and the streets were calm, just the way Clara liked them. She wrapped her scarf gently around her neck, an old one, a little faded, but full of memories. It was a gift from her late husband back when the world moved a little slower, and kindness was still something you saw on front porches. Clara didn't move quickly these days. Her knees weren't what they used to be, and the cane she leaned on had become more than a tool, it was a quiet companion. But she still walked to the corner store every morning, not because she needed anything urgent, but because it reminded her she was still part of the world. The sweet potato pies there were too sugary for her taste, but she always picked one up anyway. It was never about the pie. It was about the routine, the faces she passed, the waves from porches, the nods from neighbors. These streets held her story. This block had seen her raise 2 sons, bury 1 husband, teach Sunday school, and lead a voter registration drive back in '65 when folks were too scared to even try. Each step she took felt like stitching herself deeper into the fabric of the place. As she moved through the neighborhood, she passed a few familiar faces. Mr. Alvin sitting on his porch with his oxygen tank, a pair of teenagers laughing as they rode past on bikes, a young mother waving while watering her flowers. Everyone knew Clara. Everyone respected her. She was the kind of neighbor who remembered your birthday, showed up with soup when you were sick, and made time for anyone who needed a listening ear. When she reached the old Baptist church, she paused. The bell tower paint was peeling, but it still stood tall. Memories of the civil rights marches came rushing back, of days when she held hands with her best friend Rosetta and walked through fear anyway. She stood there for a beat, remembering, before turning the corner toward the store. The crosswalk wasn't far. The light changed, signaling it was safe to walk. Clara stepped off the curb, her cane tapping gently in rhythm with her slow, steady pace. This was her block, her street. She had the right of way. She didn't notice the police cruiser parked 2 blocks away. She didn't see the officer inside, jaw clenched, hands tight around the wheel, heart bitter from a bad morning. She didn't know that in his eyes, she was just another obstacle in the road. To Clara, it was just another day, just another walk. She was halfway across the street now, still humming to herself, the world soft around her. But somewhere behind her, an engine rumbled. A door slammed. A breeze shifted. A mother pulled her child back from the curb. And just for a second, Clara looked up. What she saw wasn't fear or confusion. It was something deeper. A realization. A knowing. The kind only people who've lived long, full lives carry in their bones. And in that blink of a moment, the morning stopped being ordinary. Officer Ryan Mercer hadn't meant to patrol this part of town that morning. He was frustrated, running on 2 hours of sleep, and still fuming from the argument he'd had at the precinct. His superior had called him out on his tone, on how he handled people, and on his growing stack of minor complaints. He didn't like being told what to do. He especially didn't like being told how to act. So when he pulled his cruiser out of the station lot, he shut the radio off and headed toward the quieter streets of the west side, hoping for some kind of control, something he could own. The neighborhood always put him on edge. It wasn't dangerous. Not really. It was just different. Older homes with chipped paint. Murals of civil rights leaders on brick walls. Elderly folks who looked him dead in the eye like they'd seen worse than anything he could throw at them. There was a pride here that unsettled him. A quiet resistance that made his grip on the wheel tighten. He turned down Ashmont Avenue, letting the cruiser hum low, tires rolling past mailboxes and parked cars. His mind wandered, irritated by the memory of his sergeant's lecture. Words like accountability and respect rang in his ears, the kind that made him feel like a kid being scolded. He wasn't in the mood. He never really was. That's when he saw her. Just ahead, crossing slowly at the light. A small woman, shoulders slightly hunched, scarf tied under her chin, moving at a careful, even pace. She didn't even glance his way. Just walked, steady and unhurried, as if she belonged there. And she did. But Ryan didn't see that. He didn't see Clara May Robinson, the woman who had lived on that block longer than he'd been alive. He didn't know she'd been teaching children to read in the church basement before his parents had even met. He didn't care that she was a grandmother, a neighbor, a cornerstone of the community. To him, she was just another person in the road, moving too slow, ignoring his presence, in his way. He told himself she should have waited. That maybe she didn't see him. That pedestrians like her were always complaining about cops on the news. The excuses came easy. The real reason was harder to name. Maybe it was the lingering anger in his chest. Maybe it was the way she didn't flinch, didn't rush, didn't give him the deference he expected. Maybe it was power. Maybe it was spite. Whatever it was, it built quickly. And before reason could cut in, his foot pressed the gas just a little more. No siren. No warning. No intent to kill, but enough to scare. Enough to remind. Enough to send a message he wouldn't even say out loud. He reached for his radio, muttering a half-thought report, nothing urgent, just enough to make it sound official. His eyes flicked back up to the crosswalk. She was still there. Still calm. Still walking like the world hadn't changed. And that made something inside him twist. He didn't see her humanity. He didn't see the cane, or the age, or the weight of decades in her slow steps. He saw defiance where there was none. He saw disrespect where there was simply presence. And he didn't stop. The moment of impact wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it. It wasn't slow motion or full of screaming. It was fast. Brutal. The front of the cruiser clipped her legs. Her cane flew from her hand. Her body folded onto the hood and then dropped hard to the street. There was a sound, a terrible sound, when she hit the pavement. Groceries scattered. A child's voice screamed her name. But Ryan didn't rush out of the car. He didn't run to help. He opened the door slowly, annoyed, as if she had caused the delay in his morning. He stepped around the front of the vehicle, not with urgency but with irritation, glancing down at Clara without kneeling, without speaking. People were gathering now. Neighbors. Children. A mailman. Someone was calling 911. Someone else was crying. But Officer Mercer just stood there, arms crossed, his shadow long and heavy over her crumpled form. When he finally radioed in, his voice was detached, mechanical. Pedestrian accident. Still breathing. No mention of what really happened. No mention of how he never slowed down. No mention of how he watched her fall and felt nothing at all. Malik Robinson was in his apartment in Atlanta when the call came in. It was early evening, and he was finishing up paperwork from a long day at the law office. The voice on the other end was trembling, Mrs. Holloway, a neighbor from back home in Birmingham. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She said Clara had been hit. That it was bad. That the police officer didn't even stop. Malik froze. For a moment, he couldn't speak. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. His grandmother wasn't just someone he loved. She was the woman who had raised him after his mother passed. She was the one who taught him to say please and thank you, who made sure he knew his worth, even when the world didn't. She was the reason he'd gone to law school in the first place. Before Mrs. Holloway had even finished explaining what hospital Clara had been taken to, Malik was already packing a bag. The drive from Atlanta to Birmingham felt longer than it ever had before. Every red light felt like a slap. Every passing car felt like a delay. He kept replaying the image of her crossing the street in his mind. Calm, steady, just doing what she did every day, and then the sudden, violent interruption. He clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. There were tears in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not yet. By the time he reached the hospital, it was just after 2 in the morning. The fluorescent lights in the ICU waiting room were harsh. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the occasional beep or cough from down the hall. When he found her room, 203, he had to pause at the doorway. His grandmother lay there so still, tubes and wires everywhere, her leg wrapped in thick gauze, her face bruised and pale. This wasn't the woman who used to hum gospel songs in the kitchen while frying catfish, or the woman who once stood on the front porch during a thunderstorm, daring the wind to knock her down. This woman looked small, fragile, breakable. A nurse came in, kind but tired. She explained that Clara had suffered multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and they'd induced a coma to help her body recover. Malik just nodded, barely hearing the words. He sat by her bed, took her hand, and whispered that he was there. That he wasn't going anywhere. Then he made a promise, not to her, but to himself. He was going to get justice. Not just because she was his grandmother, but because it was the right thing to do. Because if someone like Clara May Robinson, a woman who had spent her life giving, teaching, and loving, could be left broken in the middle of the street without a second thought, then something was terribly wrong. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Not to family, not yet. He called fellow attorneys, journalists he trusted, civil rights organizations he'd worked with in the past. He shared the little he knew and asked them to help him find the truth. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for an apology. He started collecting witness statements, tracking down video clips that had already begun to surface online. One girl, Trinity, had posted shaky footage of the aftermath. Her caption read, "Miss Clara deserves better." It had less than 100 views when he saw it. By morning, it had tens of thousands. Within hours, Malik was at the center of a growing storm. People were asking who the officer was, why there was no arrest, why the city hadn't issued a statement. And Malik was ready. He had seen cases like this buried before. He had watched systems protect their own at the expense of truth. But this time, he had something those other families didn't: a legal education, a platform, and a fierce personal reason to fight. He wasn't just a lawyer representing a victim. He was a grandson trying to make the world see his grandmother the way he did, with love, with dignity, and with the full weight of her humanity. He didn't want revenge. He wanted truth. He wanted change. And he was just getting started. The morning after Clara was hit, the block didn't feel the same. The air was heavier, like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath. Her absence was loud. The porch swing at her house didn't sway. The kids didn't ride their bikes past her stoop. The smell of her usual cornbread wasn't floating through the open windows. People gathered in small clusters, whispering. No one knew all the details, but everyone knew one thing. Something awful had happened, and the city wasn't saying much. The silence from the police department felt like a slap in the face. But the people didn't stay silent for long. It started small. A video posted by Trinity James, the young woman who lived above the bakery, began to circulate. She'd filmed from her window just after the impact. In the shaky footage, Officer Mercer could be seen stepping out of the cruiser with indifference, not rushing to help, not even bending down to check on Clara. Trinity captioned the post with 5 words, "Miss Clara deserves better." That sentence struck a nerve. Within hours, it was shared dozens of times. By that evening, it had reached thousands. Civil rights groups picked it up. Local activists reposted. Her image, a woman known for kindness, now lying broken on the street, sparked something. Then came Layla. Just 9 years old, she had been walking with Clara that morning, holding her hand when the car came. Layla's mother didn't want her speaking at first, but the little girl kept saying someone needed to know. With her mother by her side, she told a local church group exactly what she saw. She said Clara didn't run because she didn't expect danger. She said the officer looked right at them and didn't stop. Her words weren't loud, but they hit hard. People cried. Some got angry. But mostly, they listened. Witnesses began stepping forward. A mailman who had seen the whole thing from half a block away. A delivery driver who had been unloading boxes just across the street. A teenager named Jalen who had been filming a TikTok nearby and accidentally captured the moment the car sped through the intersection. Their stories matched. Clara had the right of way. The light was green. The officer didn't swerve, didn't honk, didn't hesitate. These weren't just opinions. They were facts. Malik took everything he could gather and began building a timeline. He spoke to each witness, documented each testimony. He was careful, precise, determined. He wasn't just trying to prove that something bad had happened. He wanted to prove it couldn't be ignored. Every time he posted an update, people responded. They commented with their own stories, their own frustration, their fear that if Clara wasn't safe, None of them were. The digital noise became a drumbeat. People who had never met Clara started calling city offices, demanding answers. Local churches organized prayer circles. Teachers spoke about it during class. Retirees gathered at the community center to write letters to the mayor. Murals of Clara's face began appearing on brick walls, painted by young artists who had grown up seeing her on the sidewalk, handing out mittens in the winter or watermelon slices in the summer. Her name wasn't just on people's lips. It was in their hearts. And then something shifted. The silence from the city wasn't just frustrating anymore, it felt insulting. The police department's official report was cold and vague. It said an elderly pedestrian had entered the crosswalk unexpectedly. It made no mention of witnesses. No mention of the green light. No mention of Officer Mercer's previous complaints. But people weren't buying it. They had seen too much. They had heard too much. The community began organizing not just for support, but for action. Malik wasn't leading a protest. He was leading a truth. He stood in front of every camera, answered every reporter, shared every name and video he had. He wasn't trying to stir division. He was trying to break a cycle. Clara hadn't shouted. She hadn't resisted. She had simply walked. And now, because of her, others were speaking louder than they ever had before. This wasn't just about justice for Clara anymore. It was about every neighbor who had ever felt invisible. Every elder who had ever been ignored. Every child who had learned too soon that some lives are treated like they matter less. The silence was gone now. And in its place, voices were rising. By the end of that week, Clara May Robinson was no longer just a name whispered on her block. She had become the reason people all over the city were waking up. What started as a few videos and witness statements had grown into something larger. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was purpose. It was momentum. And it was gathering fast. Malik stayed up late each night, not just by Clara's bedside, but poring over files, notes, and city records. The more he dug, the more he uncovered. Officer Ryan Mercer, the man who hit his grandmother, wasn't new to controversy. In less than 4 years on the force, he had racked up 5 complaints. 3 were for excessive force. 2 were for aggressive conduct during traffic stops. Every single one involved black residents. Every single one had been dismissed. No internal investigation. No consequences. Just paperwork and silence. Malik wasn't surprised. Disappointed, yes. Furious, absolutely. But not surprised. He'd seen this pattern before, just never this close to home. He wasn't alone in his search. People began coming forward with stories. A retired schoolteacher who had been pushed against his car. A mother who had been screamed at in her own yard for asking why an officer was in her driveway. An elderly man who had quietly carried his memory of being slammed to the ground for not moving fast enough. None of them had reported it. What would be the point, they said. No one listens. No one believes us. But now, they believed Malik might. Because this time, it was Clara. And Clara was beloved. A local librarian named Kiera took it upon herself to dig deeper. She worked days at the courthouse, nights at the library. She knew how to search public databases, how to request city records, how to find the things that didn't want to be found. And what she uncovered made headlines. Mercer's complaints weren't just numerous. They were eerily similar. Patterns of intimidation. Use of force on elders. Dismissive reports that lacked detail. The system hadn't just failed Clara. It had protected Mercer. The media picked it up. A clip of Clara being loaded into the ambulance with Mercer standing off to the side, arms crossed, had made the rounds. Now journalists were asking questions. Civil rights groups began reaching out. Students from the local university organized a town hall. Churches began printing flyers that said "We walk for Clara." And when a mural appeared downtown, a painting of Clara's face with soft eyes and a steady smile, it was shared over 1 million times online. The caption was simple: "She should have made it home." Malik kept pushing. He wasn't trying to go viral. He was trying to get someone, anyone in power, to take accountability. But something deeper was unfolding. The more people learned about Clara, the more they saw their own family in her. Their own stories. Their own pain. She became a mirror. And in that mirror, people saw not just injustice, but possibility. That maybe if enough of them spoke, someone would finally listen. A march was planned for Saturday morning. No one expected it to be large. Just a few neighbors, maybe some students. But by the time Malik arrived at Ashmont Avenue, the crowd had already started to swell. Children held signs. Grandmothers in church hats stood side by side with teenagers in hoodies. There were teachers, postal workers, veterans. Some came alone. Some came in groups. No one came for show. They came because they couldn't not come. The walk was slow, steady, just like Clara's had been. They crossed the street where she had fallen. They paused in silence. And then they kept walking. Past the church. Past the mural. Down the same path she took every morning. There were no megaphones, no chants. Just footsteps. And signs that read things like "Justice for Clara," "Protect our elders," and "Enough is enough." Malik walked near the front, Layla just behind him holding her mother's hand. The weight of it all pressed on his chest. Grief, rage, pride, but what stood out most was the unity. The city was beginning to move together. Not just for Clara, but for the world she represented. A woman who never asked for a movement, but who sparked one anyway. And that day, Birmingham felt different. It felt like something had shifted. And maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't shift back. The courtroom was already full before the doors opened. People lined the halls in silence, some with folded signs, others simply clutching each other's hands. Many had never been inside a courtroom before, but this day felt different. This wasn't just about law, it was about being present. About witnessing a moment the community had been waiting for. The name at the heart of it all wasn't unfamiliar anymore. Clara May Robinson, once just Miss Clara to her neighbors, had become the face of a fight that had reached far beyond their block. Malik Robinson sat at the front, suit crisp, back straight, his jaw tight with focus. Next to him, his legal partner Clarissa flipped through their notes with calm precision. This wasn't just another civil case. It was personal. Clara had made it through surgery, and though she was still recovering in the hospital, her story had made it all the way to this courtroom. Malik had promised her he'd carry it every step of the way. And now, he was doing exactly that. Across the aisle sat Officer Ryan Mercer. No uniform this time. Just a gray suit and a blank expression. But his presence still carried the weight of someone used to getting away with things. Someone who had always counted on the system to shield him. Not today. Today, the system had been forced to pause and listen. The prosecution opened the case with clarity and quiet power. They didn't start with legal jargon. They started with Clara. A woman who'd lived in Birmingham her whole life. Who taught kids how to read, who never missed Sunday service, who made peach cobbler for anyone going through hard times. They reminded the jury she was walking to the corner store. She had the light. She had the right of way. And she was hit by a police officer who never even braked. They showed the footage. Multiple angles. Trinity's video from the bakery window. Jalen's TikTok clip from across the street. The city's traffic camera. Grainy but clear. It showed Clara stepping into the crosswalk. Officer Mercer's cruiser accelerating. No swerving. No horn. Just cold speed. And then silence. Witness after witness took the stand. Jalen, nervous but steady, described exactly what he saw. Ellis, the delivery driver, testified about the light, the moment of impact, the officer's expression afterward, blank, annoyed, distant. Layla, brave beyond her years, spoke softly about holding Clara's hand and feeling it go limp when the car struck her. Her voice broke, and even the courtroom's toughest faces softened. The defense tried to argue distraction. That Mercer had been responding to a call, that he didn't see her in time. But the videos didn't lie. The reports didn't match the reality. And the truth was clear, he saw her. He had time. And he didn't stop. Malik took the stand too. He didn't speak like a lawyer then. He spoke like a grandson. He told the jury about growing up with Clara, about the way she used to kneel down to his level to explain the world when it was too big, about how she taught him that strength didn't always look loud, that sometimes it looked like someone crossing a street every morning just to remind herself she still could. And now, that same woman was recovering from injuries she should have never had, because someone who was supposed to protect people didn't think she mattered enough to slow down. He ended with something simple. He told them this wasn't just about justice for one person. It was about the kind of city they wanted to live in. One where grandmothers could walk to the store without fear, where silence wouldn't win, and where dignity didn't depend on who you were, or weren't, to the people in power. The courtroom stayed quiet as the jury left to deliberate. Malik returned to his seat, took a deep breath, and held on to the one thing that had carried him this far: belief. Not just in the law, but in people. In truth. In Clara. Whatever the verdict would be, one thing was already clear. The streets weren't silent anymore. And neither was the courtroom. When the jury came back into the room, it felt like the air had stopped moving. Every breath was shallow, every glance loaded with hope, fear, and the weight of weeks spent waiting. Malik sat still, hands clasped in his lap, trying to keep his heart from racing out of his chest. Clarissa gave his arm a quiet squeeze, but neither of them spoke. Across the aisle, Officer Ryan Mercer didn't flinch. He stared ahead, his face unreadable, the same flat expression he'd worn since day one. But everyone in that room knew this moment mattered more than any he'd faced before. The four-person stood, paper in hand, voice steady. The verdict was read: guilty of gross negligence and misconduct resulting in bodily harm. For a second, no one moved. It didn't erupt like a movie scene. It landed like truth often does, heavy, quiet, undeniable. Then, slowly, a wave of emotion rippled through the crowd. A few gasps, a few tears. Then came the applause, not loud, but full. Not for celebration, but for recognition. For the idea that maybe, finally, someone in power was being held accountable. Malik didn't stand. He sat there, head bowed for a moment, letting it all settle in. It wasn't victory. Not entirely. His grandmother was still healing. Nothing would erase the impact or the pain. But it was something. A line in the sand. A statement that what happened mattered. That she mattered. Officer Mercer didn't say anything as he was escorted out of the courtroom. No apology. No glance back. Just silence, the kind that echoed louder than words ever could. A week later, Mercer was officially dismissed from the force. The city announced that he would no longer be eligible to serve in law enforcement and would be required to pay restitution as part of the civil judgment. It was more than most families ever got. But it still didn't feel like enough. Not when Clara was still in a hospital bed, her body broken, her recovery slow. Malik visited her every day, sitting by her side, reading her messages from strangers, community leaders, even kids who had sent drawings and letters. And then, one morning, something changed. Clara opened her eyes. Not all the way, not for long, but enough. Enough to know she was still here. Enough to let Malik know she'd heard him. A nurse rushed in to check her vitals, and Malik stood frozen, heart pounding. When her fingers twitched again, this time stronger, he could barely breathe. She was waking up. After all the marches, all the court hearings, all the news interviews and sleepless nights, that tiny movement felt like the first real breath he'd taken in weeks. When she was able to speak, her voice was faint but clear. She asked about the case. She asked what happened after. Malik told her everything. About the mural. The crosswalk sign. The crowd that marched. The little girl who testified. And the courtroom that finally listened. Clara didn't cry. She just closed her eyes for a moment, then whispered that she was proud of him. That was all she needed to say. Word of her recovery spread quickly. Neighbors left food on her porch. A group of local students sent her a video tribute. The mayor released a statement thanking her for her strength and promising reforms. But the real change wasn't in promises. It was in the people. The ones who kept showing up. The ones who kept asking questions. The ones who had walked beside Malik, not because they had to, but because they chose to. For Malik, it wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about accountability. About honoring the woman who had raised him and raised a whole block by simply being who she was. Kind, patient, brave, and unshakably present. Now the world had seen what he'd always known. Clara May Robinson wasn't just another pedestrian. She was a teacher, a neighbor, a legacy. And thanks to a community that refused to look away, her story would carry forward long after the court case was over. Justice finally had a name. And it was hers. When Clara May Robinson returned home, it wasn't just a quiet hospital discharge. It felt like the whole neighborhood paused to take a breath. The moment her wheelchair rolled onto the front porch of her small brick house on Ashmont Avenue, people began to gather, some with flowers, others with signs, many with tears. They clapped softly, waved gently, and whispered welcome back like they were greeting royalty. And in many ways, they were. Because Clara didn't just survive. She came back carrying the weight of a movement on her shoulders, even if her body still trembled from the effort of healing. Inside, sunlight streamed through the windows just as it always had. Her favorite blanket was draped over the old recliner. A few neighbors had cleaned up the place, stocked the kitchen, even planted new flowers by the steps. The space felt familiar but changed, like everything had taken a deeper breath in her absence. Malik wheeled her inside, helping her settle in with the kind of care that didn't need words. He had fought so hard to get to this moment, but now that it was here, he just wanted her to feel peace. To rest. To know she was home. But Clara didn't want rest right away. She asked about the march. About the crosswalk sign. About the oversight board that now bore her name. She smiled, weak but proud, when Malik told her the full story, that the city council had approved civilian review of police misconduct cases and that it would be named the Clara May Commission. He watched her take it all in slowly, nodding as if trying to stitch it together in her mind, this new world that had grown from her pain. A week later, the community center hosted a gathering. It wasn't a party. It was something quieter, deeper, a celebration, a remembrance, a promise. People brought food, told stories, sang old church songs. There were posters on the walls showing snapshots of the past few weeks. Marches, murals, news headlines, children holding signs with her name. Malik stood near the back, watching it all with quiet pride. When Clara entered, the room stood. She looked smaller than most remembered, her frame a little more fragile, but her presence filled the space like it always had. She was wheeled to the front, where she waited. Patiently, taking in the faces, young and old, black and brown, new neighbors and ones who'd lived here as long as she had. When the room finally settled, Clara spoke. Her voice was soft, but no one had to lean in to hear. She thanked them, not for just standing up for her, but for standing up for each other. She said what happened to her could have happened to any elder on any street in any city. And that's what made it so important to keep walking, even when the walk feels long. She looked over at Layla, the little girl who had held her hand during the worst moment of her life, and gave her a gentle nod. The room stayed still, caught between emotion and admiration. From that point on, Clara's story didn't fade, it grew. Her face appeared on T-shirts, in murals, and in local newspapers. But more importantly, her impact began to ripple. The Oversight Board reviewed multiple past cases, reopening ones that had long been dismissed. More people began to speak up, quietly at first, then louder. Students studied her story. Churches preached it. Community groups built platforms from it. Malik, once just a grandson who raced to her bedside, was now helping train others in legal advocacy, determined to make what happened count for more than just headlines. But for Clara, it wasn't about fame or legacy. It was about dignity. About making sure no one else had to fight that hard just to be seen, just to be heard. She often said she didn't feel like a symbol. She just wanted to cross the street and come home. And maybe that was the point. Her strength wasn't loud. It was steady. It was in the everyday. And because of that, it stayed with people. On a quiet evening not long after, Clara and Malik sat on her porch as the sun dipped low over the block. The mural across from the bakery glowed in the fading light, showing her face surrounded by flowers. Below it, painted in bold letters, She crossed for all of us. Clara smiled, looked out at her street, and said nothing at all. Because some legacies don't need speeches. They just need someone to keep walking. Clara May Robinson's story teaches us that dignity, no matter how quiet or humble, is worth defending. It reminds us that age does not diminish value. If anything, it deepens it. In a world that often overlooks elders, this story calls us to listen more closely to those who've walked before us. Clara didn't shout. She didn't protest. She simply lived with grace and showed up with love, every day, for her community. And when harm came to her, it wasn't just her grandson who stood up, it was an entire neighborhood. The lesson here is simple. We all have power, whether we're speaking up or simply standing still. Standing for what's right doesn't always require a stage. Sometimes it just takes refusing to be invisible. For older viewers especially, Clara's journey is a reminder that your voice, your presence, and your lived wisdom matter deeply. And for the younger generation, it's a call to honor the shoulders you stand on. Let's build a world where no one has to fight to be seen. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear from you. What moment stood out most, and what would you like us to explore next? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you believe in stories that spark change and honor the strength in everyday people, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next powerful story we share.